Open up. This'll settle you down real quick, or at least make you easier to deal with," Dr. Leonard Graves said under his breath, tilting the orange pill bottle just enough to drop the tablets into Harold Bennett's mouth without waiting for a response. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Too tight, too satisfied. Harold lay back against the hospital bed, chest rising unevenly, the faint beep of the monitor steady but strained. He had already told him, twice, the medication list, the warning, the risk. Graves tapped the chart with his pen like it was already closed. "You people always think you know better than trained professionals." Harold swallowed slowly, gaze fixed on the doctor hovering over him, committing every detail to memory while saying nothing. Graves turned away, confident. He had no idea he'd just crossed a line that would follow him straight into a courtroom he couldn't control. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The waiting room at St. Catherine's Medical Center buzzed with the usual emergency department chaos, phones ringing, nurses calling names, and the quiet groans of those waiting for care. Harold Bennett stood near the check-in desk, one hand pressed against his chest, the other gripping his wife Lila's arm for support. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the room's aggressive air conditioning. "Sir, please just take a seat," triage nurse Dana Pike said, without looking up from her computer screen. "We'll call you when it's your turn." "My husband can barely stand," Lila protested, her voice tight with worry. "He's having chest pains and—" "Ma'am, everyone here is waiting. Please, take a seat." Harold's breath came in short bursts now. The pressure in his chest had grown steadily worse since it first hit during their anniversary dinner at Marco's. He'd insisted on driving himself to the ER, but now regretted not calling an ambulance. A young mother with a crying toddler who had arrived after them was quickly ushered back. 10 minutes later, an elderly white man complaining of a twisted ankle was taken through the double doors. "This is ridiculous," Lila muttered, supporting more of Harold's weight. "You need to be seen now." Harold kept his voice measured, though speaking took effort. "Nurse Pike, I understand you're busy, but I need to make you aware that I'm experiencing severe chest pressure, dizziness, and shortness of breath. These symptoms started suddenly about an hour ago." The nurse glanced up, her expression unchanged. "Sir, we'll get to you. Please sit down. I'm also on blood pressure medication, lisinopril, and—" "Sir, when we call you back, you can discuss medications with the doctor." Dr. Leonard Graves swept past the desk, glancing at the waiting room with practiced indifference. He paused when he saw Harold still standing there, leaning heavily on his wife. "Is there a problem here?" Graves asked, his tone suggesting the only problem was Harold himself. "Doctor," Harold said carefully, "I'm experiencing significant chest—" "Yes, yes, I heard you telling the nurse. Rather dramatically, I might add." Graves picked up a chart, scanning it without real interest. "And you've been standing here making a scene instead of sitting quietly like everyone else?" Lila bristled. "My husband is in serious pain. Ma'am, I assure you, we know how to assess genuine emergencies." Graves's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Some patients think making a fuss will get them seen faster. It won't." Harold felt the familiar burn of injustice, the same one he'd spent decades learning to channel into careful action rather than angry words. But right now, he needed medical care more than he needed to correct this doctor's assumptions. Nurse Elena Ruiz approached, concern evident in her quick assessment of Harold's gray-tinged face and labored breathing. "Dr. Graves, his symptoms are clearly exaggerated." Graves cut her off. "I've seen this type of presentation before. Usually drug-seeking behavior." Harold straightened slightly, decades of judicial dignity visible even through his pain. "Doctor, I am trying to provide relevant medical information. I have a documented history of—" "Sir," Graves interrupted, "if you continue to be disruptive, I'll have security escort you out." Now sit down and wait your turn like everyone else. Elena stepped closer to Harold, noting his worsening condition. Sir, can you tell me what medications you're currently taking? Lisinopril for blood pressure, Harold managed. Also, a daily baby aspirin and… Nurse Ruiz, Graves snapped. When I want a medication history, I'll ask for it myself. Return to your duties. Lila's voice shook with barely contained fury. How dare you speak to my husband this way? He's clearly in distress. Ma'am, your husband's theatrical performance isn't fooling anyone with medical training. If you can't control yourself, you'll need to leave. Harold gripped Lila's hand, silently asking her to hold back. He'd learned long ago that sometimes you had to swallow pride to stay in the fight. Right now, he needed to be a patient, more than a federal judge. The justice system could address this later, if he survived. Elena watched the exchange with growing horror, noting Harold's increasing pallor, and the way his breathing had become more labored. She caught the eye of another nurse, making a subtle gesture toward Harold. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably 20 minutes, a different nurse called, Mr. Bennett? Harold took an unsteady step forward, significantly weaker than when he'd arrived. Lila supported him as they followed the nurse toward the double doors. Elena hurried to help them, shooting a worried glance at Graves, who was already dismissing them from his mind as he reviewed another chart. Let's get you back and monitored, sir, Elena said softly, taking Harold's other arm. She could feel him trembling with exhaustion, his skin clammy under her touch. As they passed through the doors, she looked back at Graves with growing alarm. Something was very wrong here, and she had a sickening feeling it wasn't just about medical symptoms. The exam bay's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Harold's face as Elena helped him onto the bed. His skin had taken on an ashen tone that made Lila's hands tremble as she arranged his hospital gown. The monitoring equipment beeped steadily, recording numbers that made Elena frown. Blood pressure 178/95, she reported, wrapping the blood pressure cuff more securely around Harold's arm. Dr. Graves barely glanced at the monitor as he entered, flipping through papers on his tablet with obvious disinterest. Mr. Bennett, we're very busy tonight, so let's make this quick. Doctor, Harold said, his voice strained but precise, I need to make sure you understand my current medications and history of… Yes, you mentioned something about blood pressure medicine. Graves waved his hand dismissively. Any allergies? No allergies, but there's a critical drug interaction you need to be aware. I'll take that as a no. Graves cut him off, typing something into his tablet. Rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Lila stepped forward. Doctor, please listen. My husband is trying to tell you something important about his… Ma'am, Graves said sharply, I need you to let me do my job. Your husband can speak for himself. He turned back to Harold with exaggerated patience. Though he seems more interested in telling me how to practice medicine than answering simple questions. Elena watched Harold's jaw tighten, decades of hard-earned composure visible in how carefully he measured his next words. The pain is an 8, doctor. It's a crushing pressure in my chest that radiates to my left arm, accompanied by dizziness and shortness of breath. Graves's tone suggested he didn't believe a word. And how long have you been planning this emergency room visit? Excuse me? Lila's voice cracked with disbelief. It's a routine question, ma'am. Graves's smile was cold. We need to establish if patients have a pattern of seeking emergency care for… Attention! Harold's hands gripped the edge of the exam bed. Doctor, I was having dinner with my wife when these symptoms began. I drove myself here because I recognized the warning signs of… You drove yourself? Graves raised an eyebrow. So you weren't in that much distress then? Elena stepped forward. Dr. Graves, his vital signs indicate significant… Nurse Ruiz, Graves snapped, Please prepare 5 milliliters of hydromorphone for Mr. Bennett. Elena froze. Sir, that dosage seems... Did I stutter? Graves fixed her with a hard stare. Or do you need a refresher on the hospital's chain of command? Doctor, Harold said firmly, before you order any medication, you need to know that I have a documented sensitivity to... Mr. Bennett, Graves cut in. I don't need medical advice from my patients. I've dealt with plenty of people who try to direct their own treatment, usually because they've read something on the internet or heard something on the street about what drugs they think they need. The implication hung heavy in the air. Lila stepped between Graves and her husband, her whole body trembling with rage. How dare you suggest... Ma'am, if you can't control yourself, I'll have to ask you to wait outside. Graves turned to Elena. Nurse Ruiz, the medication. Now. Elena glanced at Harold's chart on her tablet, her stomach turning as she read his medical history. The hydromorphone interaction warning flashed in red. Doctor, according to his records. Nurse Ruiz, Graves's voice dropped dangerously low. Are you questioning my orders? No, sir. But the system is showing. The system shows whatever patients tell it. Graves's smile was dismissive. And some patients will say anything to get the medications they want. Or don't want. Harold's voice cut through the tension, quiet but razor-sharp. Doctor, I am trying to prevent a serious medical error. If you would simply review. Mr. Bennett, Graves said, drawing out each syllable like he was speaking to a child. I understand you think you know better, but I'm the one with the medical degree. Your job is to answer questions honestly, something you seem to be struggling with, and let me make the decisions about your care. Lila's hands clenched into fists. My husband is a... Ma'am, Graves warned, final warning about interfering with treatment. Elena stood frozen by the medication cabinet, her hand hovering over the keypad. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong. Harold's chart clearly documented his sensitivity to hydromorphone. The dosage Graves ordered was dangerous, even for patients without contraindications, and his symptoms clearly called for a completely different treatment protocol. She watched Graves smugly typing orders into his tablet, saw the carefully controlled fury in Harold's eyes, noticed Lila's protective stance by her husband's side. This wasn't incompetence or oversight. This was deliberate. Every dismissal, every interruption, every refusal to check the chart. Graves was choosing to ignore critical information because he'd already decided what kind of patient Harold was the moment he saw him. The medication, Nurse Ruiz? Graves prompted without looking up. Or should I note in your file that you're refusing to follow direct orders? Elena's fingers trembled over the keypad as she input the code to access the medication cabinet. Through the glass, she could see the vial that could cause Harold serious harm. Or worse. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice, and she was being forced to be part of it. Elena's hand shook as she administered the medication into Harold's IV line, her eyes fixed on his vital signs monitor. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, but Graves loomed behind her like a shadow, his presence a silent threat. Harold lay back against the thin hospital pillow, his dignity intact even in the flimsy hospital gown. Lila held his hand, her fingers intertwined with his, watching his face with the hypervigilance of someone who knew their loved one was in danger. There, Graves said, already turning toward his tablet. That should take care of your discomfort. We'll observe for 15 minutes and then discuss discharge. The first sign something was wrong came within seconds. Harold's breathing changed. Subtle at first, then rapidly becoming labored. His hand tightened around Layla's, and a sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. Something's not right, Lila said, her voice rising. Harold? Baby? What's wrong? Harold tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His free hand clutched at his chest, and the monitor's steady beeping turned erratic. The numbers on the screen began to plummet. Blood pressure dropping, Elena announced sharply. Pulse becoming irregular. Graves glanced up from his tablet with irritation. "Mr. Bennett, if you're trying to extend your stay—" "He can't breathe!" Lila's voice cracked with panic. "Help him! Someone help him!" Harold's eyes had gone glassy, unfocused. His dark skin took on an ashen tone, and his breathing came in short, desperate gasps. The monitor's alarm began to sound, first one, then another, filling the room with their urgent warning. "He's crashing," Elena said, already moving to adjust the bed flat. "Dr. Graves, this is the interaction he tried to warn you about." Graves stepped forward, finally showing concern, not for Harold, but for himself. If Mr. Bennett failed to properly disclose his medical history, "It's in his chart!" Elena's professional restraint cracked. The interaction warning was right there in red. "I tried to tell you." Harold's body suddenly went rigid, his back arching. The cardiac monitor screamed as his heartbeat became dangerously irregular. "Harold!" Lila tried to hold on to him, tears streaming down her face. "Please, oh God, please." "Step back, ma'am," Graves ordered, attempting to take control of the situation. "Mr. Bennett is clearly having an unexpected reaction." "Unexpected?" Elena's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "This is exactly what happens when you give hydromorphone to someone with his condition. The condition he tried to tell you about 3 times. Harold's oxygen levels were plummeting. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and his eyes rolled back. The monitors showed numbers that made Elena's heart race. This wasn't just a bad reaction. This was life-threatening. Graves reached for a different medication. "We'll just give him some—" "No!" Elena physically blocked his hand. "You've done enough damage." She slammed her hand on the emergency call button, then grabbed the room phone. "Code Blue, Bay 4. I repeat, Code Blue, Bay 4. She turned to the orderly who had appeared in the doorway. "Sam, get the crash cart now!" Lila had collapsed into a chair, her hands pressed against her mouth in horror as she watched her husband fighting for air. "Please save him," she begged. "Please don't let him die." The room erupted into motion as the emergency response team rushed in. Elena rattled off vital information. Patient given hydromorphone despite documented contraindication. Severe adverse reaction. BP 70/40 and dropping. Oxygen saturation 82% and falling. Cardiac rhythm irregular. Graves tried to assert authority. "As the attending physician—" "You're done here!" Elena snapped, her voice carrying over the chaos. "These people are going to save your patient's life, if you let them." The team worked with practiced efficiency, attaching new monitoring leads, preparing emergency medications, positioning the crash cart. Harold's consciousness was fading, his powerful frame now terrifyingly still, except for the desperate struggle for air. "Starting counteractive agents now," the emergency physician announced. "Push 0.4 milligauss naloxone." Elena moved to Lila's side, holding her as they watched the team fight to reverse the damage. Every second felt like an eternity, marked by the frantic beeping of monitors and the sharp commands of the emergency team. "Come on, Harold," Lila whispered, rocking slightly. "Fight, baby. Just fight." Graves stood back against the wall, his face a mask of professional concern that couldn't quite hide his fear. He watched as the team worked to save Harold's life, his eyes darting between the patient and the door as if calculating his escape. Elena kept one arm around Lila and one eye on the monitors, silently willing them to show improvement. The naloxone began to take effect, but Harold's vital signs remained dangerously unstable. This wasn't just a close call. This was a deliberate act that had nearly killed a man who came to them for help. The emergency physician called for additional medication. The room filled with more personnel, more equipment, more urgent voices calling out numbers and orders. Through it all, Harold lay unnaturally still, his life hanging by a thread because one doctor had decided he wasn't worth listening to. The monitors continued their desperate chorus of alarms, each one a testament to how quickly trust could become a weapon and how easily prejudice could turn medicine into poison. The emergency team worked with practiced efficiency, their movements precise and urgent. Dr. Faisal Reed took command immediately, his experienced hands checking Harold's vitals while calling out orders. "Get me a complete medication history," Dr. Reed demanded. "Now!" Elena stepped forward, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Patient was given hydromorphone, despite a clear contraindication in his chart. He tried to warn Dr. Graves about the interaction risk 3 times. Dr. Reed's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Who authorized that order?" "I did," Graves said, stepping forward with manufactured confidence. "The patient's presentation was complex, and—" "Complex?" "Doctor." Reed cut him off while preparing another dose of medication. The contraindication was clearly documented. This should never have happened. Charge nurse Miriam Holt appeared at the door, tablet in hand, already pulling up Harold's records. Her face darkened as she read. "Everything's right here. Complete medication history. All warnings flagged in red." Lila hadn't left Harold's side, her hand gripping his as the team worked to stabilize him. Tears streaked her face, but her voice was steel when she spoke. "You didn't even look at his chart, did you? You just saw what you wanted to see." Graves adjusted his white coat, his professional mask slipping slightly. "Mrs. Bennett, I understand you're upset, but medicine isn't always straightforward. Sometimes patients react unexpectedly." "Don't you dare," Elena interrupted, her hands shaking with rage. "This wasn't unexpected. This was exactly what he said would happen." The monitors showed improvement as the emergency medications took effect. Harold's oxygen levels began to climb, his heart rhythm steadying. His eyes fluttered, consciousness returning gradually. Dr. Reed maintained his focus on Harold while speaking to the team. "Get me a full panel of labs. I want continuous cardiac monitoring and pulse ox. Someone call the ICU. He'll need observation for at least 24 hours. Graves cleared his throat. "As the attending physician, you are not making any more decisions about this patient's care," Dr. Reed stated firmly, not even looking up from his work. "Nurse Holt, please note in the chart that I'm taking over as attending." Harold's breathing became more regular, the desperate gasping replaced by steady, if shallow, breaths. Lila pressed her forehead to his hand, whispering prayers of thanks. The immediate danger was passing, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the room. Charge Nurse Holt moved efficiently through the space, directing staff and updating records. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes were hard when they landed on Graves. "Administration will need incident reports from everyone involved." "Of course," Graves said smoothly, his composure returning as the crisis ebbed. "I'll make sure to document the unusual nature of Mr. Bennett's reaction." "Unusual?" Elena couldn't contain her disbelief. "You gave him medication he specifically said would harm him. There was nothing unusual about his reaction. It was textbook." Dr. Reed finished adjusting Harold's oxygen flow and turned to face Graves directly. "This goes way beyond a simple medication error. The patient warned you. The chart warned you. The nurse warned you. This isn't about complex medicine. This is about not listening." Harold stirred on the bed, his eyes opening slightly. Lila leaned closer, stroking his face. "I'm here, baby. You're going to be okay." Elena watched as Graves's expression shifted, seeing the moment he decided on his strategy. His features arranged themselves into practiced concern, his posture straightening. He was no longer a doctor who had nearly killed a patient. He was a professional managing an unfortunate situation. "I'll need to speak with administration immediately," Graves said, already edging toward the door. "This kind of complicated presentation requires proper documentation." "Complicated presentation?" Nurse Holt repeated incredulously. "That's what you're calling this?" But Graves was already moving, his voice carrying back as he spoke into his phone. "Yes, I need to report a complicated case. Patient with unclear history. Unexpected medication response." Elena felt sick listening to him spin the story, watching him transform negligence into narrative. She'd seen this before. Doctors protected by systems designed to shield them from consequences, especially when their victims were minorities who didn't know how to fight back. The room had calmed somewhat, the frantic energy of emergency giving way to the steady rhythm of recovery. Harold's vital signs continued to improve, each beep of the monitor a small victory. But Elena could see the trauma written on Lila's face, could feel the wrongness of what had happened settling into her own bones. Dr. Reed finished writing orders and looked at Elena. "Good catch on the emergency response. You probably saved his life." "I should have stopped it sooner," Elena said quietly. "I knew something was wrong from the beginning." "You did everything right," Nurse Holt assured her. "Some people just think they're above being questioned." Through the glass walls of the bay, Elena could see Graves talking to hospital administrators, his gestures calm and reasonable. She watched him point to charts, shake his head sympathetically, transform assault into accident with every practiced word. Harold's eyes opened fully for the first time since the crisis began. His gaze was clear despite his weakness, taking in the room, the staff, his wife's tear-stained face. The monitors showed his heart rate increasing slightly, not from medication this time, but from the realization of what had been done to him. Harold's room had grown quieter, the medical emergency giving way to something else entirely. Hospital Administrator Cynthia Vale stood at the foot of his bed, her designer suit and perfect posture a stark contrast to the clinical setting. Next to her, Richard Voss, the hospital's legal counsel, flipped through admission papers with practiced casualness. "I want to personally assure you that St. Catherine's takes patient care very seriously," Vale said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "We'll be conducting a full review of today's incident." Lila hadn't left Harold's side, her hand still gripping his. "Incident!" Her voice trembled with barely contained fury. "My husband almost died because that doctor wouldn't listen." Voss looked up from the paperwork, his expression carefully neutral. Then his eyes widened slightly as he reached a particular page. He touched Vale's elbow, directing her attention to the document. The change in their demeanor was subtle, but immediate. "Judge Bennett," Vale said, her tone shifting to something more deferential. "I had no idea we were hosting such a distinguished guest. Your reputation for fairness in the Eastern District is well known." Dr. Graves, who had been hovering near the door, went perfectly still. The color drained from his face as the implications hit him. He'd just given negligent care to a federal judge, one known for his precise legal reasoning and unflinching integrity. Elena watched the realization ripple through the room. She saw Graves's momentary panic before his features smoothed into professional concern. He stepped forward, already crafting his defense. "Your Honor," Graves began, "I need to address the confusion about your medical history. If you had been more forthcoming about your medications—" "More forthcoming?" Elena couldn't stay silent. "He told you 3 times. I heard him." "Nurse Ruiz," Vale cut in sharply, "perhaps you should check on your other patients." "She stays," Harold said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since regaining consciousness. His voice was weak, but carried the weight of decades on the bench. "She's a witness to everything that happened here." Voss stepped closer, his legal pad ready. "Judge Bennett, We want to ensure all perspectives are properly documented. Dr. Graves notes that there may have been some miscommunication about your medical history. Miscommunication? Lila straightened in her chair. My husband listed every medication he takes. He warned about interactions. That man, she pointed at Graves, didn't even pretend to listen. Mrs. Bennet, Vale soothed, medical situations can be very complex. This wasn't complex, Elena interrupted. The contraindication was flagged in red. Everything was in the chart. Dr. Graves chose to ignore it. Graves moved to the foot of the bed, his confidence returning as he committed to his story. Your Honor, while I regret any discomfort you experienced, the fact is that patients often forget crucial details in stressful situations. If you had mentioned— I did mention it, Harold said, each word precise, despite his fatigue. 3 times, as Nurse Ruiz stated. You dismissed each warning. You also dismissed my symptoms, my concerns, and my dignity. Now you're attempting to dismiss the truth. The room went silent. Vale and Voss exchanged glances, calculating risk and exposure. Graves opened his mouth to respond, but Vale raised her hand slightly, stopping him. Judge Bennet, Voss said carefully, we want to address any concerns you may have about your care. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, without unnecessary personnel present. Elena felt the pressure to leave, to let them manage this behind closed doors. But Harold's next words stopped her retreat. Nurse Ruiz stays, he repeated, and I suggest everyone think very carefully about what they document in my chart. Falsifying medical records is a serious offense. Graves's professional mask cracked slightly. Are you threatening me? Stating facts isn't threatening, Doctor, Harold replied. Neither is telling the truth. You saw a black man in your ER, made assumptions about his character, and decided he wasn't worth your full attention or care. You didn't know who I was then. You know now. And that knowledge is clearly affecting how you choose to remember events. Vale stepped forward, damage control mode fully engaged. Judge Bennet, I assure you that St. Catherine's has strict policies against any form of discrimination. We pride ourselves on— Ms. Vale, Harold interrupted, his voice tired but firm. I've heard enough corporate assurances for one day. I'd like to be discharged, assuming Dr. Reed approves. Of course, Vale said quickly. We'll have the paperwork prepared immediately. And please know that the hospital is prepared to discuss any concerns. I'm sure we'll have many discussions in the future, Harold said. But right now, I want to go home with my wife. Elena watched as the administrators retreated, taking Graves with them. Their whispered conversations echoed down the hall. Damage control already in motion, story already being reshaped. She began preparing the discharge paperwork, her hands shaking slightly as she documented everything she had witnessed. Lila helped Harold sit up slowly, her movements gentle, but her eyes still burning with anger. They think they can just cover this up, she said softly. They think money and lawyers will make it go away. Harold watched through the glass as Graves consulted with Voss, their heads bent together over documents. They're used to people without power to fight back, he said. Used to victims who can't challenge their version of events. The drive home was silent, streetlights casting intermittent shadows across Harold's face as Lila navigated their sedan through empty streets. His breathing had steadied, but the weight of what happened pressed heavy on both their minds. Their house, a stately colonial with white trim, stood dark except for the porch light they'd left on hours earlier, before dinner had turned into a nightmare. Inside, Harold sank into his favorite leather armchair, looking smaller than Lila had ever seen him. She touched his shoulder, feeling the slight tremor that still ran through his body. I'm calling Naomi, she said firmly. No arguments. Harold nodded, too drained to protest. Dr. Naomi Ellis had been their family physician for 15 years, earning their trust through competence and genuine care. Within 30 minutes, her silver Volvo pulled into their driveway. "I came as soon as Lila called," Dr. Ellis said, setting her medical bag down. Her calm presence filled the room as she took in Harold's pale complexion. "Tell me everything." While Naomi checked his vitals, Harold recounted the evening's events in precise detail. The initial symptoms, the waiting room, Graves's dismissive attitude, and the medication that nearly killed him. His voice remained steady, but his hands clenched the armrests when he described Graves cutting off his attempts to explain his medical history. Dr. Ellis's face darkened as she reviewed the discharge papers. "This is completely indefensible," she said, tapping the medication order. "Given your documented cardiac history and current prescriptions, this combination could have caused fatal arrhythmia. Any first-year resident would know better." "That's exactly what Elena, the ER nurse, tried to tell him," Lila interjected, pacing behind Harold's chair. "We need to report him immediately. He can't be allowed to treat other patients." Harold reached for her hand, stilling her movement. "We will," he assured her, "but not in a way they can dismiss as emotional reaction to a unfortunate incident." His jaw tightened. "I've seen too many valid complaints buried under bureaucratic language and institutional defense." Dr. Ellis finished her examination, recording her findings in neat script. "Your blood pressure is still elevated, but your heart rhythm has stabilized. I want you to rest tomorrow. No negotiations." She looked directly at Harold. "And I mean real rest, not working from home." "I need to document everything while it's fresh," Harold insisted. "Every word, every action, every person present." "Fine," Dr. Ellis conceded, knowing better than to argue. "But limit it to 2 hours, then rest. I'll come back tomorrow evening to check on you." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Harold, what Graves did, this wasn't just poor judgment. This was active negligence at best, intentional harm at worst." "I know," Harold said quietly, "and the speed with which they tried to rewrite events tells me this isn't his first time." He looked up at both women. "Think about it. He was so confident in dismissing my symptoms, so quick to ignore stated medical history. That comes from practice, from knowing the system will back you up." Lila's hand tightened on his shoulder. "You think there are others?" "I'm certain of it," Harold replied. "People without the protection of title or position. People the system expects to suffer quietly." He reached for his leather-bound notebook, the one he used for case notes. "That's why we need to be methodical, gather evidence, build an irrefutable case." Dr. Ellis nodded, understanding the strategy. "I'll review your complete medical history. Document why that medication choice was dangerous given your condition. They won't be able to claim confusion or miscommunication." "Thank you, Naomi," Harold said, "but please don't document anything in their system yet. I don't want them to know we're building a case." As Dr. Ellis packed up her bag, Harold began writing, his pen moving steadily across the page. Each detail emerged with judicial precision: times, names, exact quotes. The physical pain lingered in his chest, but purpose drove him forward. Lila brought him water and his evening medication, the ones actually prescribed by Dr. Ellis, watching him with worried eyes. "You should be sleeping," she said softly. "Soon," he promised, not looking up from his notes. "But first, I need your help remembering every detail, every person who came in and out of that room, every change in their behavior after they realized who I was." They reconstructed the evening piece by piece, cross-referencing memories until well past midnight. Harold's handwriting remained steady, each page a careful record of casual cruelty and institutional arrogance. As the night deepened, Harold set down his pen and looked at his wife. "Before they can alter anything else, We need those records, complete and unedited. Every test, every note, every order. His voice carried the quiet authority that had served him well on the bench. First thing tomorrow, we request everything. Lila understood. The hospital would already be sanitizing their documents, crafting their defense. I'll go in person, she said. Make sure they can't claim they never received the request. Harold nodded, finally allowing exhaustion to show. The night's work was spread before him, pages of notes that would become the foundation of justice. Not just for him, but for everyone who had faced Dr. Graves without the shield of position or power. The morning light streamed through the hospital's administrative windows as Lila Bennett stood at the records desk, her posture straight and determined. She placed the formal request for Harold's complete medical records on the counter, making direct eye contact with the clerk. I need a receipt showing the exact time and date this was submitted, she said firmly. Down in the ER, Elena Ruiz logged into her shift, her stomach tight with anxiety. Something made her check Harold's chart before starting her rounds. Her fingers froze over the keyboard as she noticed the changes. The medication administration time had shifted by 15 minutes. New notes appeared, claiming Harold had been combative and refused to disclose his medical history. The explicit warnings he'd given about drug interactions, warnings she'd personally witnessed, were nowhere to be found. Elena glanced around the quiet nurse's station. Moving quickly, she began taking screenshots on her phone, her hands shaking slightly. The original timing of events, the real sequence of what happened, it was all being erased, replaced with a sanitized version that protected Dr. Graves and the hospital. Before she could finish, a message popped up on her screen. Access to this record has been restricted. Please contact administrative support for assistance. In his home office, Harold spread out the records they'd received across his desk. His reading glasses perched on his nose as he methodically compared what was written to his own detailed notes from the night before. Look at this, he said to Lila, pointing to a particularly egregious entry. According to these notes, I became agitated and refused to cooperate with examination. That never happened. Lila leaned over his shoulder, her face tightening with anger. They're painting you as the problem patient, making it seem like any complications were your fault. Classic strategy, Harold replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades observing institutional behavior. They're building a defense based on making the victim appear unreliable. The hospital's official response arrived later that morning, typed on crisp letterhead. Administrator Cynthia Vale's signature graced the bottom, her words a master class in professional deflection. Dear Judge Bennett, we take all patient concerns seriously and are conducting a thorough review of your case. Our records indicate all treatments were administered according to standard protocols. We appreciate your patience as we gather complete information. Harold set the letter down, his expression grim. Notice how they acknowledge my title now. The same hospital where Dr. Graves couldn't be bothered to listen to my symptoms suddenly remembers I'm a federal judge. Back at St. Catherine's, Elena sat in her car during lunch break, staring at her phone. The screenshots she'd managed to capture showed clear evidence of tampering, but using them meant risking everything. Her job, her references, her ability to work in healthcare. She thought of her mother's sacrifices to put her through nursing school, the mortgage she'd finally qualified for last year. Then she remembered Harold's face as the wrong medication took hold, the way Dr. Graves had dismissed him, the casual cruelty wrapped in medical authority. She thought of other patients, ones without Harold's resources or position, who might have suffered similar treatment. The hospital's upper floors buzzed with careful damage control. In a corner office, Richard Voss met with Cynthia Vale, their voices low despite the closed door. The records have been appropriately updated, Voss said, straightening his tie. Everything reflects proper procedural compliance now. Vale nodded, her manicured fingers drumming on her desk. And access has been restricted? To essential personnel only. Though that nurse, Elena Ruiz, accessed the file this morning before the restriction went into effect. Monitor her closely, Vale replied. She seemed concerned during the incident. Meanwhile, Harold made several careful phone calls from his home office. Each one helped build a clearer picture of how the hospital operated, how they handled similar incidents. He noted patterns emerging, the careful language, the strategic edits, the way problems disappeared into bureaucratic silence. This isn't just about medical malpractice anymore, he told Leela, as they reviewed his findings. They're actively falsifying records, restricting access, building a false narrative. That moves this into criminal territory. Elena's shift ended at 7, but she stayed late, watching Dr. E. Graves interact with other patients. She noticed things she'd overlooked before. How his demeanor changed based on who he was treating. How certain patients received cursory exams while others got his full attention. Making her decision, Elena waited until the evening shift change was complete. She found a quiet moment to slip into Dr. Naomi Ellis's office, having observed the family physician making her evening rounds. "Dr. Ellis," Elena said softly, closing the door behind her. "I need to speak with Judge Bennett. Privately. There are things happening here, things in the records, that he needs to know about." "And you can't go through official channels?" Dr. Ellis asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Elena shook her head. "They're changing everything, erasing what really happened. And it's not just his case." She pulled out her phone, showing Dr. Ellis the screenshots. "I think this is a pattern, but if I come forward officially..." Dr. Ellis studied the evidence, then looked up at Elena with understanding. "I'll arrange a meeting. Somewhere safe, away from the hospital." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Dr. Naomi Ellis's office windows as Harold and Lila Bennett sat across from Elena Ruiz. The young nurse's hands trembled slightly as she placed her phone on the desk, displaying the screenshots she'd managed to capture. "It's not just about your case, Judge Bennett," Elena said, her voice steady despite her obvious tension. "I've watched Dr. Graves for months now. The way he changes, it's like dealing with two different doctors." Harold leaned forward, his expression grave. "Tell me what you've observed. With certain patients, usually white, well-dressed, professionally employed, he's thorough, patient, even charming." Elena's fingers twisted together in her lap. "But with others, especially older black patients, or people he assumes can't fight back, he becomes someone else, dismissive, cruel even." Lila's hand found Harold's, squeezing gently. They both recognized the pattern. It was as familiar as breathing. "There was this case last month," Elena continued. "Rosalind Wade. She came in with chest pain, just like you. Dr. Graves barely examined her. When complications developed, he blamed her for not being clear about her symptoms." Elena pulled up another set of screenshots. "Her records were altered too, the same way they tried to change yours." Dr. Ellis, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "I reviewed Mrs. Wade's case afterward. The complications were entirely preventable, if someone had just listened to her." Harold's jaw tightened. "Do you have contact information for Mrs. Wade?" 2 hours later, Harold and Lila sat in Rosalind Wade's modest living room. Family photos lined the walls, children's graduations, grandchildren's birthdays, moments of joy and achievement that spoke of a life built with care and determination. Rosalind Wade herself sat carefully in her armchair, her son Trevor standing protectively nearby. The resemblance between them was clear, the same determined set to their mouths, the same watchful dignity. When Dr. Ellis called, I almost didn't agree to meet, Rosalind admitted. What's the point of reliving it? But then she mentioned what happened to you, Judge Bennett. She smoothed her skirt, a gesture that seemed more about gathering strength than tidiness. And I thought, maybe this time someone will listen. I'm listening, Mrs. Wade, Harold said softly. Please, tell me everything. As Rosalind spoke, the parallels became frighteningly clear. The same dismissive tone from Graves, the same refusal to acknowledge symptoms, the same quick assumption that she was exaggerating or seeking attention. He looked right through me, she said, her voice tight with remembered hurt. Like I wasn't even worth the time it would take to really check what was wrong. Trevor Wade moved closer to his mother's chair. I wasn't there when she first went in, he said, anger threading through his words. But I was there for the aftermath. When the complications hit, they tried to act like it came out of nowhere, like Mom had somehow caused it by not being compliant enough. They use that word a lot, Lila noted. Compliant. As if questioning their judgment makes us responsible for their mistakes. Mistakes? Trevor's laugh was bitter. These aren't mistakes. This is a system working exactly how some people want it to work. Harold watched Rosalind's hands, steady now as she showed them her own medical records. He thought about his position, his title, all the authority he carried, authority that hadn't protected him in that first emergency room encounter. But that made the hospital scramble once they discovered who he was. Mrs. Wade, he said carefully, what happened to you and to me, it's part of something larger, something deliberate. And I believe we have an opportunity to expose it. You mean fight the hospital? Rosalind looked uncertain. Judge Bennett, I appreciate the thought, but people like us rarely win those battles. That's exactly why this matters, Harold replied, because I'm not just people like us anymore. I'm a federal judge who nearly died because of the same prejudices that hurt you. They can't dismiss me as easily as they dismissed you, and I intend to use that fact. Mom, Trevor said softly, maybe this is what we've been waiting for. A chance to make them answer for what they did. Lila leaned forward. Mrs. Wade, we're not asking you to stand alone. We're asking you to stand with us, to help show that what happened wasn't isolated or accidental. Rosalind looked at her son, then back at the Bennetts. Years of learned caution warred with the need for justice in her expression. Finally, she nodded. Tell me what you need from me. As they left the Wade home an hour later, Harold felt the weight of responsibility settling deeper on his shoulders. His status as a federal judge had always been both shield and sword in the fight against injustice. Now it would serve as both again, not just for him, but for Rosalind Wade and others like her. Across town, Elena Ruiz climbed the stairs to her apartment, exhausted from her shift and the emotional drain of the afternoon's meeting. She noticed the official envelope immediately, its crisp hospital letterhead stark against her welcome mat. Her hands were steady as she picked it up, but her heart raced as she read the suspension notice inside. The formal language couldn't disguise the threat. Pending review of protocol violations. The morning light had barely touched the windows of Jonah Price's law office when Harold and Lila Bennett arrived. Dark circles under Harold's eyes betrayed his sleepless night, but his posture remained as straight as ever. Doctor. Naomi Ellis followed them in, carrying a thick medical file, while Elena Ruiz slipped through the door last, looking over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed. Jonah Price's office wasn't flashy, just clean, organized, and purposeful, like the man himself. Books on civil rights law lined the walls, and his desk held neat stacks of active case files. He rose to greet them, his handshake firm and steady. Judge Bennett, Jonah said, I've reviewed the preliminary notes you sent over. Let's get everything laid out properly. He gestured to the conference table where legal pads and pens waited. Harold placed his detailed account on the table. Everything is documented chronologically, starting with the initial wait time disparities. Lila touched her husband's arm. Tell him how it felt, Harold. Not just what happened. Harold's carefully maintained composure wavered for a moment. I knew what was happening the moment Dr. Graves dismissed my symptoms. I've seen that look countless times. Like my pain wasn't real. Like my life wasn't worth his full attention. Elena stepped forward, placing her copied screenshots on the table. I have the original records, before they started changing them, and timestamps showing when modifications were made. Jonah examined the electronic records, his expression darkening. This is deliberate obstruction. They're not just covering up negligence, they're actively falsifying medical records. He looked up at Elena. You're taking an enormous risk bringing this forward. I already received a suspension notice, Elena said, her voice tight but determined. But I can't stay silent. Not when I know this wasn't an isolated incident. Dr. Ellis spread out her own medical assessment. From a physician's standpoint, the medication choice was inexcusable. The interaction risk was clearly documented. This wasn't a mistake. It was willful disregard for patient safety. Jonah began taking rapid notes. We're looking at multiple causes of action here. Medical malpractice is just the starting point. There's evidence of systematic discrimination, fraudulent documentation, conspiracy to cover up negligence. He turned to Harold. The hospital will try to buy silence with a settlement. This isn't about money, Harold said firmly. This is about stopping a pattern of abuse. Mrs. Wade's case proves Graves targets specific patients. How many others have been harmed because they couldn't fight back? Lila squeezed Harold's hand. Tell him about last night, Harold. About how you barely slept, remembering the feeling of your breath failing while that man stood there, watching. Harold's professional mask slipped further. I kept thinking, if this could happen to me, with all my education and position, what chance do others have? I've spent my career upholding the law. I can't walk away from this. Jonah nodded, understanding. We'll file in federal court. Not your district, obviously. We'll want this completely clean of any appearance of conflict. The complaint needs to name everyone. Graves, the hospital administrators, anyone involved in the cover-up attempt. Elena provided names and titles, her voice growing stronger. Cynthia Vale, the administrator who ordered the records locked down. Richard Voss from legal, who started damage control before they even knew if Judge Bennett would survive. Dr. Ellis added her clinical analysis. I've documented every deviation from standard care protocols. The pattern shows deliberate choices, not errors in judgment. They worked through the morning, building the complaint piece by piece. Harold's legal training helped shape the narrative, while Lila kept redirecting them to the human impact. Elena provided crucial timeline details, and Dr. Ellis translated medical negligence into clear violations of care standards. The hospital will claim internal review processes haven't been exhausted, Jonah said, organizing the exhibits. But the active falsification of records creates immediate, irreparable harm. We can argue for emergency intervention. They'll attack Elena's credibility, Lila pointed out. Try to paint her as a disgruntled employee. Let them try, Elena said. My performance reviews are perfect. They suspended me for protocol violations, but won't specify which protocols. The timing alone proves retaliation. Harold reviewed the draft complaint, his judicial experience spotting potential weaknesses. We need to emphasize the pattern. My case opened the door, but this filing is about systematic discrimination in medical care. The press will pick this up fast, Jonah warned. A federal judge nearly killed by Dr. Bias. It's going to explode. Good, Lila said firmly. Let everyone see what's happening in that hospital. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. By late afternoon, the complaint was polished and ready. Jonah's staff prepared the filing while he reviewed the exhibits one final time. Harold stood at the window, watching the city below. "Having second thoughts?" Lila asked softly. "No," Harold replied. "Just thinking about responsibility. The system trusted me with authority. This is how I have to use it." At exactly 4:30 p.m., Jonah Price filed the complaint electronically. Within an hour, his phone began ringing with calls from local reporters. The first battle was joined. Elena straightened her shoulders, despite her obvious exhaustion. "I should head home. Tomorrow's going to be interesting." "You're not alone in this," Harold assured her. "None of us are anymore." The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as reporters clustered around Jonah Price. Camera lights flashed while he delivered measured statements about institutional accountability and patient safety. Inside his office, Harold and Lila Bennett watched the coverage on a small television, while Elena sat nervously checking her phone. "Channel 7 is running with the audit trail story," Jonah said, returning from his press conference. "The timestamps don't lie. They changed those records after you collapsed, Judge Bennett." Harold nodded grimly. "How long before the hospital responds?" "They're already." Jonah's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. "Speaking of which, 3 reporters asking about Elena's suspension. They smell blood in the water." Elena wrapped her arms around herself. "I knew they'd come after me, but—" Her phone chimed with another message. "My co-workers are sending warnings. Dr. Graves is on a rampage in the ER. Let him lose control," Lila said. "The more he shows his true nature, the better." The office phone rang. Jonah's assistant patched through a call from a local news producer. They wanted Elena for an interview about workplace retaliation. For a moment, it felt like momentum was building, like truth might actually break through. That feeling lasted exactly 47 minutes. Richard Voss's first counterstrike came via email to every major newsroom in the city. The hospital's official statement questioned Elena's emotional stability and history of workplace conflicts. It mentioned numerous documented instances of protocol violations without specifying a single one. "They can't just lie like that," Lila protested. "They can imply anything they want," Jonah said grimly. "The damage is done before we can even respond." Elena's phone buzzed again. Her hands shook as she read the message. "Sarah Martinez, the other nurse who saw what happened, she just backed out. Says she might have misremembered some details." "What changed her mind?" Harold asked quietly. "The hospital's parent company owns shares in the nursing agency her husband works for," Elena said. "They got to her through him." Jonah's office became a war room as the attacks escalated. Each hour brought new challenges. The hospital's legal team filed motions questioning the admissibility of Elena's screenshots, citing chain of custody issues and internal privacy policies. "They're trying to bury the evidence under procedural challenges," Harold explained to Lila. "Make it so technically complicated that the truth gets lost in legal maneuvering." Dr. Graves himself remained carefully invisible, speaking only through carefully worded statements from the hospital's PR team about his distinguished record of service and commitment to equal care for all patients. By late afternoon, Richard Voss had orchestrated his masterpiece. A former colleague of Elena's appeared on local news, describing her as emotional and prone to exaggeration. The woman's statement was perfectly crafted, not quite defamation, but devastating in its implications. "That's Jessica Torres," Elena said numbly, watching the interview. "We worked together for 3 years. She was at my wedding." Her voice cracked. "They must have promised her the head nurse position I was in line for." Lila paced the office, her anger building. "So this is how they do it. They don't just hurt people. They destroy anyone who dares to speak up about it." Harold sat at Jonah's conference table, reviewing the growing stack of hostile filings. His judicial experience let him see the strategy taking shape. They weren't just attacking the evidence. They were trying to shrink the entire case down to nothing more than a simple medication error. "Look at this motion," he said, holding up a document. "They want to exclude any mention of other patients or pattern of behavior. Make it impossible to prove discrimination." Jonah nodded grimly. "They're trying to isolate your case, make it seem like a one-time mistake rather than systematic abuse. Without supporting evidence, the truth doesn't matter if we can't prove it in court," Harold finished. The sun was setting when the final blow landed. A judge had granted an emergency motion limiting the scope of evidence that could be presented at initial hearings. Elena's screenshots were temporarily suspended pending further review. The hospital's internal investigation records were declared privileged. Jonah closed his laptop with a heavy sigh. "Judge Bennett, I need to be straight with you. They're boxing us in. Without Elena's evidence, without supporting testimony, without the ability to show pattern and practice," he spread his hands, "Graves might walk away with nothing more than a minor settlement and some bad publicity." The office fell silent. Outside, the media vans were already packing up, moving on to the next story. Power was doing what power did best, smothering truth under an avalanche of legal machinery and institutional pressure. Elena stared at her phone, now filling with messages from former colleagues distancing themselves from her. "They're not just trying to win the case," she said softly. "They're sending a message to anyone else who might think about speaking up." Lila took Harold's hand, feeling the tension in his grip. She could see the weight of it crushing down on him, not just his own injury, but the realization that even a federal judge could be rendered nearly powerless against systemic injustice when it closed ranks to protect its own. Harold sat in his home office well past midnight, surrounded by stacks of medical records and billing documents. His near-death experience had left him physically drained, but his mind remained razor-sharp. Something about the hospital's aggressive response didn't add up. "Look at this," he said to Lila, who refused to let him work alone. "Every time they altered my chart, they also changed the billing codes." Lila leaned closer, squinting at the papers. "What does that mean?" "It means this isn't just about covering up what Graves did to me." Harold spread out several documents across his desk. "These changes affect how much they charge insurance companies." The bedroom phone rang. At this hour, it could only be Jonah Price. Harold put him on speaker. "Judge Bennett, are you sitting down?" Jonah's voice crackled through the line. "I've been talking to a federal investigator named Simone Talbot. She's been looking into St. Catherine's billing practices for months. Get her over here," Harold said immediately. "Tonight?" An hour later, Simone Talbot stood in Harold's office, her precise movements matching her crisp federal investigator's demeanor. She laid out her own files next to Harold's records, while Elena Ruiz, who'd joined them, studied the patterns with growing recognition. Every time Dr. Graves dismissed a patient's symptoms or gave substandard care, Elena said, the charts would change afterward. "I thought it was just covering his mistakes, but the changes always included updated billing codes," Simone finished. She pointed to specific entries. "Look here. When they edited your chart, Judge Bennett, they didn't just remove evidence of the wrong medication. They added procedures that never happened and upgraded the complexity codes." Jonah paced the room, energy returning to his step. "They're not just protecting Graves. They're using his discriminatory practices to commit insurance fraud." "The pattern is clear," Simone said, her voice cold with professional anger. "Dr. Graves targets patients he thinks won't fight back. Primarily, older black patients, working-class families, people with limited English. He provides minimal care while the hospital bills for maximum services." Harold's hands clenched. "And if anyone complains about poor treatment, the altered records make it nearly impossible to prove." Simone nodded. "The same changes that hide his negligence also justify their inflated bills." Elena pulled out her phone, scrolling through saved screenshots. That's why they were so desperate to discredit me. My copies show the original charts before they were changed. And now we have proof the changes weren't just about medical records, Jonah said. They were part of a systematic billing fraud scheme. Lila touched Harold's shoulder, feeling the tension there. They thought they could bury what happened to you under procedural objections and legal maneuvering. They never imagined their financial crimes would expose their medical ones, Harold said quietly. Simone spread more documents across the desk. St. Catherine's has been on our radar for suspicious billing patterns, but we couldn't prove intentional fraud without access to their internal systems. Now, thanks to Elena's screenshots and your case, Judge Bennett, we can show exactly how they're doing it. Through targeted discrimination, Harold said, the pieces fitting together. Graves gives substandard care to vulnerable patients, knowing they're less likely to challenge him. Then the hospital uses those cases to pad their billing. Making money from racism, Lila said bitterly. Profiting from people they think don't matter. Elena studied the billing codes with growing horror. All those patients I watched him dismiss. He wasn't just being cruel. He was setting them up to be exploited. The hospital protected him because he was useful, Jonah added. His prejudice gave them cover for their fraud. Simone gathered her files with precise movements. I'm authorizing emergency subpoenas for their complete billing and medical records. They won't be able to stonewall a federal fraud investigation. They can't hide behind careful statements and PR spin anymore, Jonah said. They'll have to answer real questions under oath. Harold stood slowly, his physical weakness at odds with his restored sense of purpose. They thought institutional racism was invisible enough to ignore. But they forgot. Sometimes injustice leaves a paper trail. Financial crimes often expose human ones, Simone agreed. Once we open their books, we'll find every patient Graves targeted. Elena hugged herself, remembering all the times she'd felt helpless watching Graves dismiss patients. Will this really stop them? Money talks, Jonah said. The hospital might not care about discrimination lawsuits, but federal fraud charges will terrify their board of directors. Simone checked her watch. I can have agents serving subpoenas by morning. The hospital's lawyers won't be able to block these. Fraud investigations bypass most of their procedural objections. And once we have access to their records, Harold said, we can prove every change, every false bill, every patient Graves mistreated. Lila squeezed his hand. They wanted to make you feel powerless. Instead, you found their weakness. Justice finds its path, Harold replied quietly. Sometimes through unexpected doors. Simone gathered her briefcase, her movements precise and purposeful. I'll need formal statements from all of you, especially Elena's direct observations of their documentation practices. We'll start serving subpoenas at first light. For the first time since his collapse in the ER, Harold felt the full weight of his judicial authority returning. The hospital had tried to bury their crimes in bureaucracy and legal manipulation. Now they would face questions they couldn't script, investigations they couldn't control, and consequences they never saw coming. The federal subpoenas hit St. Catherine's Hospital like a thunderclap on a clear morning. Dr. Leonard Graves stood in Administrator Cynthia Vale's office, watching her perfectly manicured fingers drum against her desk while she read through the documents. This is concerning, she said, her voice carefully modulated. Very concerning. It's nonsense, Graves snapped, but his usual confidence wavered. We've handled complaints before. Not like this. Richard Voss leaned against the wall, his lawyer's calm slipping. Federal fraud investigators don't make social calls, Leonard. Through the office windows, Graves watched agents moving through the hospital corridors with purpose. They weren't asking permission anymore. They were taking files, copying records, interviewing staff. Everything I did was justified, Graves insisted. Emergency medicine requires quick decisions. Quick decisions that consistently affected certain types of patients? Voss's tone had gained an edge. And always resulted in higher billing codes? Cynthia straightened a pen on her desk that was already perfectly aligned. Dr. Graves, we need to know what else might surface. What other patterns might emerge. The word patterns hit Graves like a physical blow. Are you suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything, she cut him off smoothly. I'm asking what else we need to prepare for. Down in the Federal Investigation Command Center, formerly Conference Room B, Simone Talbot methodically built her case. Harold Bennett sat with her, reviewing files as they emerged. Look at this one, Simone said, sliding over a chart. Elderly black woman. Clear cardiac symptoms. Graves diagnosed anxiety. Billed for a full workup, he never performed. Harold nodded slowly. And when she came back 3 days later? Different doctor found the blockage Graves missed. But by then— Simone's voice trailed off. By then, it was too late. Harold finished quietly. The pattern repeated through file after file. Patients dismissed, symptoms minimized, treatments rushed or skipped entirely. But the billing always showed comprehensive care. He targeted people he thought wouldn't fight back, Simone said, arranging documents in precise rows. But he also chose people whose complaints would be easier to discredit. Making prejudice look like protocol, Harold observed. Back in administration, Graves paced Vale's office like a caged animal. This is ridiculous. I'm one of your top physicians. You were, Cynthia corrected gently. But right now, we need to focus on damage control. Damage control? Graves turned on her. I've made this hospital millions. Careful, Voss warned sharply. That's not a helpful line of discussion. But Graves was unraveling. The careful facade of professional distance cracked, revealing the ugly certainties beneath. These people come in expecting everything for nothing. Someone has to make hard choices. Dr. Graves, Cynthia's voice could have frozen water. I think you should take some leave while we— Leave? After everything I've done for you? His composure shattered completely. You know exactly how I operate. You've always known. I think we're done here. Voss stepped forward. Dr. Graves, I suggest you contact independent counsel. Independent? Graves stared at them. You're cutting me loose? We're protecting the hospital, Cynthia said smoothly. As we must. In the investigation room, more evidence mounted. Simone's team uncovered years of altered records, each change crafted to hide substandard care while maximizing billing. He was systematic, Harold noted, studying the patterns, confident no one would look too closely. The privilege of authority, Simone replied. People see what they expect to see. A junior investigator rushed in with fresh files. Ma'am, we found more cases, at least 30 more with the same pattern. Harold maintained his careful composure, but his hands tightened on the folder he held. Each case represented someone like him, someone Graves had deemed unworthy of proper care. Upstairs, Graves stood alone in his office, watching his career crumble. His phone buzzed with a message from Elena Ruiz. She would be testifying publicly about his pattern of care. The nurse he'd dismissed, the patient he'd nearly killed, the judge he never saw coming. All the careful walls of privilege and protection were falling, leaving him exposed. In the hospital cafeteria, Elena sat with her union representative, reviewing her upcoming testimony. Her hands shook slightly as she read through her statement, but her voice remained steady. Are you sure about this? The representative asked. Going public is a big step. Elena thought about all the patients she'd watched Graves dismiss. All the times she'd stayed quiet, telling herself she was being oversensitive. All the harm done behind closed doors by men who assumed their authority made them untouchable. Yes, she said firmly. I'm done being afraid of respected monsters. the investigation expanded hour by hour. More staff came forward. More patients were identified. More evidence emerged of systematic discrimination wrapped in medical authority. Graves watched it all unravel from his increasingly isolated position. The hospital he'd assumed would protect him was already calculating the cost of cutting him loose. The system that had insulated his prejudice was preparing to sacrifice him to save itself. And through it all, Harold Bennett maintained his careful dignity, letting evidence speak louder than anger. He'd survived Graves's contempt. Now he would ensure justice through the patient application of law, not the satisfaction of revenge. The federal courthouse hummed with tension as Elena Ruiz approached the witness stand. Her navy blue blazer was pressed perfectly, her steps measured and deliberate. She had spent countless nights rehearsing this moment, but now that it arrived, a strange calm settled over her. Harold and Lila Bennett sat in the front row, their presence both supporting and grounding. Behind them, Dr. Naomi Ellis waited with other medical professionals who would testify. Dr. Leonard Graves sat at the defense table, his usual polished arrogance now showing hints of strain. Elena raised her right hand as the clerk administered the oath. The familiar words carried new weight. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Please state your name and position for the record. Jonah Price began, his voice steady and clear. Elena Ruiz. I'm a registered nurse at St. Catherine's Medical Center, currently on administrative leave. Ms. Ruiz, please tell us about the night Judge Bennett came to the emergency room. Elena's voice remained steady as she recounted each detail. Judge Bennett arrived with chest pain and dizziness. He was made to wait, while others with less severe symptoms were seen first. What happened when Dr. Graves finally saw him? Judge Bennett clearly listed his medications and medical history. He specifically mentioned a dangerous interaction with certain drugs. Elena's gaze never wavered. Dr. Graves cut him off mid-sentence. He acted like Judge Bennett was wasting his time. In the gallery, Harold sat perfectly still, his face composed. Leela's hand tightened around his. What happened next, Ms. Ruiz? Dr. Graves ordered the exact medication Judge Bennett had warned about. I checked the chart twice because it made no sense. When I tried to raise concerns, Dr. Graves reminded me he was in charge. Elena described the rapid deterioration after the medication was administered, her voice growing tighter. Judge Bennett's vitals crashed. He could barely breathe. Dr. Graves tried to blame it on undisclosed history, the very history Judge Bennett had tried to tell him about. Graves shifted in his chair, his jaw clenching. His attorney scribbled rapid notes. What happened to the medical records afterward? Jonah asked. They were altered. The original entries showed Judge Bennett warning about the medication. Those warnings disappeared. New notes appeared, claiming he'd been unclear about his history. The timing of the medication administration was changed. Did you preserve evidence of these changes? Yes. Elena's voice strengthened. I took screenshots of the original entries before they were modified. The system keeps an audit trail of all changes, showing exactly when and who made them. Dr. Naomi Ellis was called next. She took the stand with quiet authority, her medical credentials impeccable. Dr. Ellis, in your expert opinion, was the medication Dr. Graves prescribed appropriate? Absolutely not. She shook her head firmly. Given Judge Bennett's clearly documented condition and medication history, that prescription was inexcusable. Any first-year resident would know better. Could this have been a simple oversight? No. Her response was immediate. The warning about this specific interaction was in his chart. It would have required deliberately ignoring multiple safety alerts in the electronic system. Throughout the testimony, Harold maintained his dignified composure. He didn't need to show anger or pain. The facts spoke clearly enough. His very presence, calm and observant, seemed to make the evidence more damning. When Graves took the stand, his usual smooth confidence showed cracks. He tried to frame the incident as a simple misunderstanding in a busy ER. "I make quick decisions to save lives," he declared. "Sometimes patients aren't clear about their histories." "Are you saying Judge Bennett wasn't clear?" Jonah asked. "He was agitated, difficult to understand." Elena's earlier testimony hung in the air. Her clear description of Harold calmly listing his medications while Graves dismissed him. The original records showed Judge Bennett specifically warned about this medication, Jonah pressed. Why did those warnings later disappear? Medical records are complex, Graves deflected. Updates and clarifications are routine. Are complete rewrites after adverse events routine? Graves's composure slipped further. "I made appropriate medical decisions based on the information I had." "The information you chose to hear," Jonah corrected. "Or should we review the audit trail showing exactly when these routine updates occurred?" The room felt the shift as Graves's answers grew increasingly evasive. His carefully maintained facade began to crack. "I don't recall the exact timing of record updates," he said, his voice tighter. "ER situations are fluid." "But you recall being certain Judge Bennett was difficult to understand?" "That's not... Graves stuttered, his polished demeanor crumbling. "You're twisting my words." The gallery watched his control dissolving. Every deflection, every contradiction, made the truth more obvious. This wasn't about one rushed decision. This was about power, prejudice, and the assumption that some patients could be dismissed without consequences. Elena sat straight-backed in the witness box, no longer afraid. Harold observed it all with judicial clarity, while Lila's presence reminded everyone of the human cost behind the legal proceedings. The institutional silence that had protected Graves for so long was finally, irrevocably broken. The courthouse steps had barely cooled from the morning's testimony when Simone Talbot's team descended on St. Catherine's Medical Center. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing records and computers before anyone could routinely update more files. The morning's revelations had given them all the authority they needed. Dr. Leonard Graves stood in his office, watching agents box up his files. His white coat, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a target on his back. His hands shook as he tried to text his lawyer. "Your privileges are suspended, effective immediately," Cynthia Vale announced from his doorway. Her usual polish had cracked, revealing the fear beneath. "The board is convening an emergency session." "You promised to handle this," Graves hissed at her. "You and Voss both said..." "That was before federal investigators got involved." Vale's voice was ice. "Before we knew the extent of your pattern." Down the hall, Richard Voss was having his own crisis. Investigators had found emails showing he'd orchestrated the record alterations, coached staff on consistent messaging, and buried previous complaints about Graves. His legal expertise had become evidence of calculated obstruction. "The hospital will cooperate fully," Voss told Simone Talbot, sweat beading on his forehead. "I want to be clear about that. You're about 5 months and several felonies too late for that," Talbot replied, scanning through his emails. "But do keep talking. Every detail helps." In the hospital cafeteria, Rosalind Wade sat with 3 other former patients, sharing their stories with investigators. The fear that had kept them quiet was dissolving in the light of Harold's case. "He rushed me out, too," Rosalind explained. "Ignored everything I said about my symptoms. When I got worse, they said I must have done something wrong." Her voice strengthened. "But Judge Bennett proved we weren't making things up. We weren't the problem." The State Medical Board convened an emergency review by video conference. The evidence was damning. Multiple instances of negligent care targeting specific patient demographics, falsified records, and dangerous prescribing patterns. They voted unanimously to suspend Graves's license pending full investigation. "This isn't just about one bad reaction," the board chair declared. "This is about systematic abuse of medical authority and public trust." Graves paced his office like a caged animal. His phone buzzed constantly. Colleagues distancing themselves, journalists seeking comment, lawyers offering representation. The carefully constructed walls of his privilege were crumbling. "You can't do this," he snapped when security came to escort him out. "I'm a respected physician. I've saved lives." "And endangered others," the head of security replied firmly. "Please don't make this more difficult." In the administration wing, Vale and Voss faced their own reckonings. Federal investigators had found a pattern of institutional protection that went far beyond Graves. Every complaint buried, every record altered, every victim pressured into silence had left a trail. "We were protecting the hospital's reputation," Vale insisted to investigators. "You were protecting your power to harm people without consequences," Talbot corrected. "That's going to cost a lot more than some bad publicity." The district attorney's office moved quickly, preparing multiple charges: criminal negligence, falsification of medical records, healthcare fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. What began as one act of medical racism had exposed an entire system of protected abuse. Harold watched it unfold from his chambers, receiving updates from Jonah Price and Simone Talbot. He took no pleasure in the destruction of careers, but he felt the deep satisfaction of truth finally breaking through. "They never thought they'd face judgment," Lila observed, sitting with him. "They were so used to being the ones who judged others." "Power without accountability corrupts everything it touches," Harold replied. "Even medicine." By late afternoon, news vans gathered outside St. Catherine's. The story had exploded. Respected doctor brought down by his own prejudice, exposed by the very kind of patient he thought he could dismiss without consequences. Graves emerged from the hospital's main entrance, escorted by security. His shoulders were slumped, his expression dazed. Camera flashes caught his face as reporters shouted questions. The walk to his lawyer's waiting car seemed endless. Harold and Lila stood quietly near the hospital entrance, watching. They didn't need to speak or gesture. Their presence was statement enough. Dignity outlasts arrogance. Truth outlasts power. Justice may be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied. Other former patients began arriving, drawn by the news coverage. They gathered near Harold and Lila, forming an informal witness line. Each person Graves had dismissed or endangered now stood as living testimony to his fall. "I never thought I'd see this day," Rosalind Wade whispered, joining them. "Never thought anyone would believe us over him." The cameras caught it all. Graves's hunched retreat, the steady gazes of his former victims, the quiet strength of the judge who had turned the tables. No one needed to gloat or shout. The truth, finally unveiled, spoke loudly enough. Security opened the car door for Graves. As he ducked inside, his eyes met Harold's for a brief moment. All his excuses, all his assumptions of immunity, all his casual cruelty, none of it could protect him now. The car pulled away, carrying him toward a future he never imagined facing. The reforms at St. Catherine's Medical Center came like waves, each one washing away more of the old order. Harold Bennett sat in the newly established Patient Safety Committee meeting, watching the hospital transform under the weight of truth and consequences. "We're implementing mandatory bias training for all staff," the new chief of medicine announced. Her name was Dr. Sarah Martinez, brought in specifically to rebuild trust. But more importantly, we're creating multiple channels for patients and staff to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Elena Ruiz, now wearing the title of Patient Safety Officer, presented the new protocols she'd helped design. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had stood her ground and been proven right. "Every adverse event will be reviewed by an independent panel," she explained. "No more internal cover-ups, no more pressure to stay quiet." She caught Harold's eye and gave a small nod. They both knew the cost of speaking up, and the higher cost of silence. Lila squeezed Harold's hand under the conference table. 6 months had passed since that night in the emergency room, but the changes kept coming. The hospital's board had been restructured. New oversight committees included community members. Regular audits ensured medical records couldn't be altered without trace. After the meeting, Rosalind Wade joined them in the hospital cafeteria. She'd become a regular presence, helping other patients navigate the system and demand proper care. The fear that once kept her quiet had transformed into steady purpose. 2 more families came forward this morning, she told Harold and Lila. They said seeing what happened here gave them courage to speak up at other hospitals. "The ripples keep spreading," Lila observed, stirring her coffee. Harold nodded. "That's why we couldn't let it end with just one doctor. The whole system needed light." Dr. Naomi Ellis arrived, carrying a stack of patient satisfaction surveys. The numbers told their own story. Complaints down, trust slowly rebuilding, staff more attentive to every voice. "We're seeing real change in how patients are treated," she reported, "especially in the emergency department. No one wants to be the next Dr. Graves." The mention of his name brought a moment of silence. Graves was awaiting trial, his medical license permanently revoked. The evidence had been overwhelming. Dozens of cases of discriminatory care, falsified records, dangerous prescribing patterns. His fall had sent shockwaves through the medical community. "Some of the staff still don't understand," Elena admitted. "They think we went too far, that one mistake shouldn't end a career." "It wasn't one mistake," Harold replied quietly. "It was a pattern of deciding whose lives mattered less. That's not medicine. That's prejudice with a prescription pad." They walked together through the hospital corridors. Where once Harold had been dismissed and endangered, now heads turned with recognition and respect. Not because of his title, but because he had forced truth into a place built to resist it. A group of medical students passed by, deep in discussion about ethics and accountability. The lessons of St. Catherine's had already become a teaching case. How bias corrupts care, how systems protect themselves, how change requires courage at every level. "Remember when they wouldn't even let you sit down?" Lila murmured, watching staff hurry to hold doors and clear paths. "I remember," Harold said. "But this isn't about making them serve us. It's about making them serve everyone equally." They stopped by the emergency department, where Elena had first noticed something wrong. The waiting room had been redesigned. More seats, better triage protocols, clear posting of patient rights. The same space, transformed by awareness and consequence. A young black woman was being checked in, describing chest pain. The triage nurse listened carefully, documented everything, ordered immediate tests. No dismissal, no assumptions, no casual cruelty masked as medical judgment. "That's what victory looks like," Rosalind said softly. "Not punishment, but protection. Making sure the next person gets the care we were denied." Dr. Martinez approached their group, tablet in hand. "The External Review Board approved our new policies," she announced. "Complete transparency, mandatory reporting of disparities, quarterly community oversight meetings." Harold reviewed the documents, noting how many of the changes echoed points from his original complaint. The hospital that had tried to bury his case was now legally bound to prevent similar harm. "It's a good foundation," he said, "but standards only work if people enforce them." "That's why we need you to stay involved," Elena replied. "Your presence reminds everyone what's at stake." They made their way toward the main entrance, passing walls now covered with patient rights information in multiple languages. Staff who had once looked away now met their eyes, offering respectful nods or quiet greetings. At the front doors, Harold paused. He remembered stumbling through here, weak from the wrong medication, burning with the knowledge of deliberate harm. Now he stood straight and strong, with Lila beside him, in a space transformed by refused injustice. "Ready to go home?" Lila asked. Harold looked around one last time, at Elena heading back to her office, at Roslyn speaking with a concerned family, at the steady flow of patients receiving the care they deserved. The hospital hadn't just changed its rules, it had changed its reality. "Yes," he said, "our work here is done." Together, they walked through the doors that had once nearly closed on his life. The afternoon sun was bright, and the path ahead was clear. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.